here, and they're dying to hear what you have to say. I've promoted this on the app and a lot of good feedback. So why don't we start? Just tell us who you are and give us a little background, and we'll get started from there.
Sure. Well, first, glad to be with you. Thrilled, in fact. I'm fairly new to TikTok, but you are clearly killing it on TikTok. But my daughter Mary said, "Dad, you got to be on TikTok," so I do what she says. So, well, first things first. I'm a proud father. My wife Lauren and I have three great kids. We live here in Austin. My wife Lauren is the center of my life. We've been married 37 and a half years, and she's just wonderful. She's an art teacher, a potter, and a teacher, and so my family is the first and most important thing in my life. I'm also a writer. I'm a podcaster. I'm a film producer. I host the Power Hungry podcast. I write on Substack at robertbryce.substack.com. And I have a new docuseries, a 5-part docuseries called Juice, Power, Politics, and the Grid that we published, came out on Wednesday. It's on YouTube. It's free. Why did I do it? I got blacked out here in Austin in 2021 during Winter Storm Uri. We made this docuseries to underscore the why the grid is our most important energy network, how it's being fragilized, and what we need to do to strengthen it, which in a word is nuclear, and we need nuclear energy. We need to get busy.
Absolutely. And I know, so I watched Juice, How Electricity Makes the World, and a ton of my followers watched it too. We've actually talked about it quite a bit, about that documentary, and it was a great documentary. And wow, I learned so much. I had no idea until I watched that 1 in 6 people in the world didn't have access to electricity. Like that one statistic just blows my mind. And as I do, I went back and double checked, and it was true.
It is remarkable, and energy poverty is really the defining disparity in the world today. And so I'm really proud of that documentary, and we made that a feature-length film back in 2019. With this project, with the docuseries, we decided, explaining the electric grid it's not simple. It's not simple at all. And rather than try and make one 80-minute film or 100-minute film, we thought we're going to break this up into 5-minute or 20-minute sections, 20-minute episodes. And I think that was a good decision. We have 5 episodes. It's about 110 minutes overall. And it was a good move because it just, the world is going, we're on TikTok. The world is going towards short form content, if you haven't noticed.
Yes, it is. So quick question, because this is just my curiosity before we get into some stuff. How many times have you testified before Congress?
7 overall. I submitted written testimony last month on electric vehicles. And I'm every time they call me, I say, well, of course I'll do it, because I'm flattered to be asked, and I view it as without sounding too grandiose. I mean, it's my job as a citizen. I don't get paid for it. I'll pay my way, because I this is what I do. And so it's an honor to be asked. And if they ask me, damn right, I'm going to show up.
Oh yeah, who wouldn't? Who wouldn't? Well, so let's get right into it. And just, for the people on TikTok who make everything political, my sense about Robert is that he doesn't care much about the politics, kind of like me. So when we talk about things where politics can be involved, don't read too much into that, because I know that we're both people that just study data and research, and that's where our focus is. It's not on politics. So let's try to keep the politics out of it. Joe Biden's recent actions on LNG. I believe it is a political move, but what are your thoughts on that, and what do you think any potential ramifications are?
Well, I think it's disappointing. I mean, deeply disappointing. And, what are my politics? I'm not a Republican. I'm not a Democrat. I'm disgusted, and I am totally disgusted. I mean, I don't want to be part of either party. And I look at the 2024 presidential race, and I think we can only choose between these two guys. There are 330 million people in this country. And we only get to choose between these two doddering fools. I'm sorry. That's how I see it. So it's deeply depressing. But I think that, we need leadership in this country. And unfortunately, this administration, and again, I say this not as a partisan, I think it's just the facts, is that they're anti-hydrocarbons. They just are, and they're in the thrall of a lot of these NGOs, climate activist groups who claim wrongly that we can run the world on wind and solar. It can't be done. It won't be done. But this LNG export ban on the permits, it's very cynical. It's all about politics. It's going to chill investment in the United States. It hurts our European allies. It helps Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping. I mean, from nearly any perspective, it's a bad move, except for the politics of Biden wanting to cater to the anti-industry industry, and that's what they are. The Sierra Club, NRDC. I'm longtime critics of those groups. They're policy groups, and they don't have to deliver anything to customers. They don't have to deliver electrons or molecules. They just are interested in policy and political wins. And this is a political win for them, but it's a loss for consumers. It's a enormous waste of capital. It's just wrongheaded.
Yeah. And for the people in the comments section, Robert Bryce is also friends with Robert Ray Peer, who I met on TikTok and have interviewed. And I always go back to something he said, it was 10 or 12 years ago. He said in a Forbes article that misinformation leads to bad energy policy, or misinformation about energy leads to bad energy policy. And I think another thing that leads to bad energy policy is creating your policy on the whims of other groups and people, and not just creating an energy policy and having it in place. And it feels like, honestly, over the last couple of administrations, maybe even the last 3 administrations, a lot of our energy policy was just kind of, we flew by the pants, and it was what was popular in the moment. And I feel like that's terrible for our future energy security and all of the things we need to be doing.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'm glad you mentioned Robert. He's a good friend of mine. He's an Oklahoman like us, and so he's from Hugo, Oklahoma. And for people who don't know Hugo, when I was a kid, and Robert remembered this, Barnum and Bailey Circus used to summer in Hugo, Oklahoma, or winter rather. They used to go there for the winter, and one time they lost an elephant. They lost an elephant, and it went off in the woods near Hugo, and it went on the lam for like weeks. They couldn't find this, the woods, and it was so, forested down there. They lost an elephant. And so he remembered that story, but one of the charms of Hugo, Oklahoma. But Robert is a verified expert on refining, anything to do with industry production, refining, chemical production. He's a chemical engineer. He's went to Texas A&M, which is okay, I guess. But he's a great guy.
Yeah. And personally, as an oil and gas expert, I have been immersing myself in the recent past year, whatever, in other forms of energy, tried to broaden my skill set. And I don't know if you have seen the roadmap to net zero 2050. I don't know if that's a document you've ever looked at. But when I looked at that, here's my thing, Robert. I think when it comes to climate change, we relied on the science, we relied on data, and it was studied for decades. And, it seems to be very well data-driven, scientific-driven, but the energy transition itself seems to be more about like ideology, and like we're not using the same level of data and science to determine how to generate the other forms of electricity we need. And I find that so ironic that we're not relying on that to try to achieve what we're trying to achieve. So net zero by 2050, what are the odds it happens?
Slim and none, and slim left town, as my father used to say. It's just not going to happen. There's no way, Matt. It's just the idea that we're going to quit using hydrocarbons. Okay, well, you can assume that, we'll build a lot of wind and solar stuff. Okay, I get the argument. but we still have to we have to produce the steel to put that stuff up. We have to have trucks to deliver that stuff to where it lives. We have to have cement and concrete to put it in the ground. You can't do that without diesel fuel. You can't do it without gasoline. You can't make these things happen without hydrocarbons. So, I understand the sentiment and I understand the allure. And when you talk about renewables when you talk about wind and solar, I don't call them renewables. I don't call them green. I don't call them clean. They're none of those. Those are marketing terms. Clean, green, renewable. Those are marketing terms. The alternative energy industry is being propelled. It's the fuel of alternative energy is federal subsidies. That's why we're building wind and solar. Full stop. This idea that it's cheaper. No, it's not cheaper. Not when you consider the full cost of the entire system. And that's one of the reasons why I was motivated to do this docuseries. We got blacked out here in Austin in 2021. Well, how is it that in Texas, the energy capital of the universe, our grid came so close to failure? And in fact, a few weeks after the disaster, in fact, it came we found out it was 4 or 5 minutes away from complete shutdown. Well, that would have been a disaster. So that set us on the road to make this docuseries. It's available, juicetheseries.com, juicetheseries.com. We made this because we were compelled to make it, but it goes back to, I'm coming back to your point, these ideas around that we can run the world without hydrocarbons, without coal, oil, and natural gas. They're not based on anything close to reality. The math and the physics don't lie.
Well, not only that, but the EIA under the Biden administration, their energy outlook looking out to 2050 still shows us producing the exact same amount of oil and natural gas that we are today.
Yeah.
And
it is interesting that, even under this administration, which is anti-hydrocarbon, there's just no doubt about it, that the U.S. oil and gas industry is producing record quantities. I mean, we're producing record amounts of oil. In fact, in the history of the oil business, no country's ever produced more than the U.S. is producing now. We're producing more natural gas than any other country ever has produced. And that's on top of what we're existing already, very large volumes. So it's a testament to technology. It's a testament to the capital in the industry, and also to private ownership of mineral rights. That's one of the other keys to the U.S. success in these areas.
Yeah. And so the first three things on the roadmap, and they're the only ones I'm going to talk about, but the first three things on the roadmap to net zero to 2050. The first thing was no new coal plants by the end of 2021. And I'm not sure if you realize this, but it is 2024, Robert, and people are still building coal plants. The other one, no new oil and gas development by the end of 2021.
Right.
Those are the first two things. And coal is expanding. Countries are adding coal. Oil and gas is obviously expanding. The third thing, the thing that needed to be done by the end of 2025, is basically every boiler in the world has to be replaced with something renewable.
Right.
And just that one thing alone, if you think about every building that has a boiler in it, what a monumental, it's insane to look at what it actually takes to get there and to think we can achieve it. And the reason it bothers me so much is not that I don't want to cut emissions, because I love the environment, but I believe in setting goals you can achieve. And when you set goals that are impossible to achieve, that it self-destructs. You make it so impossible to achieve that you get to a point where you lose all of your credibility and the entire thing just self-destructs. That's a personal opinion. Yeah. But that's the problem I have with net zero to 2050, is that it's a marketing thing. It's not a scientific based approach to what we're trying to do.
Well, and the other point that I've been making now for more than 15 years now is if we're serious about reducing emissions, let's set net zero aside, because I think they're, as you say, and it's a key point, China now is building, that last year they permitted 2 new coal plants per week. China is leading the world in nuclear deployment, but the amount of new coal-fired power plants that they're building, the amount that's being built is 5 times the amount of nuclear capacity that's being built on a capacity basis. So we have to be very sober about where the U.S. stands with relation to the rest of the world. It's not U.S. warming. It's not America or Texas warming or Oklahoma warming. It's global warming. This is a global issue. But that brings me back to what my point earlier. If we're serious about reducing emissions and not destroying the economy globally, what's the best no regret strategy? It's end to end, natural gas to nuclear. I've been saying the same thing now for more than 15 years. This is the way we should be going, right? Because natural gas globally is not just abundant, it's super abundant. The technology is well developed, and the same with nuclear. And we're making progress on nuclear, and that progress has accelerated since the Russian invasion of Ukraine. But we need to move even faster. And right now, the U.S. is really not moving. I mean, we're moving forward, but not with any great speed. Canada now has really stolen a march on the rest of the world. In fact, just this week, they announced they're going to refurbish 4 reactors at the Darlington station, which is an enormous announcement. And Canada is clearly leading the world now in terms of new nuclear and plans for expanding nuclear outside of Russia and China.
Yeah, and I read a statistic, and I haven't verified it enough, but I did read from a good source that over the last however many years, we've actually decommissioned 1/3 of our nuclear power globally. Does that sound about right?
That's an interesting number. That sounds a little high to me. We are retiring nuclear in the U.S. We're also retiring coal, which is, I think, a bad move until we can replace them with nuclear. This is one of the other issues facing the U.S. grid is declining reliability because we have declining thermal capacity on the grid. So, but 1/3 of nuclear capacity globally, that number sounds high. But still, even if you put that aside, nuclear in the U.S. is the largest source of zero carbon electricity. It's about almost 20% of all U.S. electricity production. The U.S., despite the decline in our fleet, we're still producing more nuclear electricity than any other country in the world.
Yeah. So I've heard a lot of what you've had to say about wind and solar, and so viability of wind. And one of the issues, I think one thing we really agree on with wind is the land use issue.
Right.
But just overall, what are your thoughts on wind? And we'll get to solar after that because I think solar's better. But what are your thoughts on wind?
Sure. If I could, I just want to jump back to the boiler question for just a second, which is in New York, Local Law 97, which was passed when Bill de Blasio was in office as mayor. That boiler issue is front and center now in New York because the law says all the buildings in New York have to replace their boilers with heat pumps. It's insane. It will not happen. It's impossible. So that issue is front and center in the city of New York right now, and in particular because Christmas of 2022, the city almost lost their gas network. It almost went down. So, these issues are not just about politics and climate change. They are, in fact, in some cases, just about survival. And the systems upon which we depend are critical life support systems. So, back to the wind question. I'm a longtime critic of the wind business, proudly so. I'm sure they don't like me. I don't like them back. I've seen how this industry has acted in rural America. And if the oil and gas industry had acted like the wind industry, it would be front page news in the New York Times. And they try and bully and intimidate local communities. In 2021, they sued Madison County, Iowa, to try and force the county to accept a wind project that the county didn't want. In the docuseries, I'm very proud of episode 3. We have almost an entire episode about the Osage Nation and their fight against a wind project. As you do, I have deep roots in Oklahoma. My great uncle, Ernie Rapp, was a member of the Osage tribe. He was born in Fairfax in 1909. He had a front row seat to the Reign of Terror. I mean, what we're seeing with the way Enel, this Italian company, went into Osage County, Oklahoma, violated the tribe's sovereignty, mined on tribal land without the tribe's permission, and now they've been slapped down by a federal judge and ordered to remove all 84 wind turbines. It's a massive, massive decision, a landmark ruling, and a huge embarrassment for the wind industry. Massive win for the Osage tribe, and I got to tell you, man, I am enjoying the heck out of it. I just think it is so good because the tribe fought him. They fought him in federal court, and in December, a federal court judge in Tulsa sided with the tribe and said the NL had violated the tribe's sovereignty, violated their mineral estate, and they have to remove these wind turbines. So that's just one example of how these land use conflicts are playing out all across rural America. This one was on traditional Native American land, but they're playing out from Maine to Hawaii, and I've documented all of them in the Renewable Rejection Database.
Yeah, and I've made a couple of videos on what happened up there, the Osage. I think I titled one of them "Killers of the Flower Moon Renewable Edition" or something like that. Talk a little bit about the two giant offshore wind projects that are recently halted there off the East Coast, there, the Northeast.
Right. You also asked about solar, and I'll finish that one thought because I went off on wind. But I mean, the push now is clearly for more solar, and one of the reasons is it has higher power density. Power density of solar is 10 times that of wind, so it doesn't require as much land. And so a lot of developers are now pushing for solar for good reason because of that, because of the smaller footprint. But even though the footprint is far smaller, it doesn't mean that local communities are welcoming these projects. In fact, in January alone, there were 2 projects that were rejected, 2 solar projects rejected. I've tweeted about them. I've added one of them to the Renewable Rejection Database. But, solar has good attributes. I have 8 kilowatts of solar on the roof of my house, but it's not going to replace thermal generation. So I'm bullish on solar. I think it's going to grow, but the wind push is going to die down because of the land use conflicts and the lack of good spots. But so solar is going to continue to grow. I diverted, or I went back on that, and I forgot the question you asked. You asked me about something else. Now I've forgotten what it was.
The BP Equinor big
right,
wind
yeah.
offshore wind projects that they pulled out of.
Right, offshore wind. And I think the latest was Ørsted pulling out of Maryland, I think, was it? But in any case, a lot of these projects are being canceled, or the developers are pulling them back and saying we need more money. Again, this cheers me no end. I've only seen a whale in my life one time, and it was a breathtaking experience. And all of these wind projects that are being built, many of them rather, that are being proposed for the East Coast are right in the middle of North Atlantic right whale habitat, well-known North Atlantic right whale habitat. It's not in dispute that these projects are being built in the habitat of one of the most endangered animals in the world. Now, imagine if the oil and gas industry were trying to do this. Well, we're going to put hundreds of platforms, offshore platforms, in the middle of endangered species habitat. Not just endangered species, not some weird bug or something. This is charismatic megafauna, right? These are whales. Mm-hmm. And yet the Biden administration, on whose side are they? They're on the side of these offshore wind companies, nearly all of which are foreign companies. I mean, this is environmentalism turned on its head. Where are the true carers for the environment, for the ones who want to protect nature, that want to protect, whales and open space? I mean, it's just, we've replaced environmentalism with climatism and renewable energy fetishism. I mean, it's gone, the thinking about the natural environment has just gone off the rails.
Yeah. Yeah, and I have become, the more I learn about it and the more I read, I've become a big proponent of nuclear, and you probably have a lot to do with that. But what are the roadblocks with nuclear? What is it the investment? Because they spent $16 billion on those offshore wind projects before they pulled out of them. Yeah. So what's the biggest roadblocks to expanding nuclear?
Well, I like that you brought it up right after the offshore wind, because, the New York Times had this glowing full two-page spread just a few days ago on this new offshore wind project that was being built. And they mentioned, I think it's $2 billion and it's 150 megawatts or so. You do the math, it's $15 million a megawatt. $15 million $15,000 a kilowatt. Well, that's the same that the plant Vogel in Georgia, which was that plant went way over budget, way over time, cost way too much because for several reasons, but it was the first of a kind. If we're going to spend $15 million a megawatt, let's build nuclear, damn it. Why would we do it offshore wind where we know the projects are going, the output is going to decline? They're going to be very difficult to maintain because anything you put in salt water corrodes, and it corrodes very quickly. And it costs extraordinary amounts of money, and it's intermittent. It might produce 40% of the time, 50% of the time, depends, right? You know, whose numbers you believe. But I just think it's an enormous waste of capital. It's an enormously expensive way. I mean, the only more expensive way to produce electricity than offshore wind is actually throwing cash in the boiler. I mean, it's just insanely expensive. There's no more expensive way to produce electricity than offshore wind. And yet there's this fetishism around it. And we've heard these promises about how much offshore wind we're going to have. And during the Obama administration, we're going to have 30 megawatts, 30 gigawatts by 2020. We don't have 30 gigawatts. We have barely 40 megawatts. I mean, it's just, but they're forging ahead, and it's mostly foreign companies that are going to get the money, get these investment tax credits. And it just chaps my hide. I just don't understand why there is this headlong rush for this, what is essentially a terrible way to produce, to generate power.
Yeah. And, one way when I talk to guys in the oil and gas industry, when we talk about offshore wind, when you talk about offshore oil and gas, those are massive projects, very expensive, right? And in order for those to be successful, those offshore wells have to produce an enormous amount of oil and gas, right? Yeah. If an offshore well just produced what any onshore well would, then they wouldn't go offshore, right? And I don't see the extra power generation from offshore wind that would justify the cost. Right. It's almost like the amount of energy you would get from something onshore, but spending all of the extra money to do it offshore, if that makes any sense.
Yeah. Well, and the other key here, I've talked about, just the number of offshore platforms that are going to be required to build significant quantities of offshore wind capacity. We can talk about the whales and the impact on migratory mammals, whales included, but also just the offshore environment and the industrialization of the oceans. We can talk about the material intensity of this because offshore wind, and the International Energy Agency has documented this, it is the most material intensive, that is copper, steel, concrete, et cetera, most material intensive way to produce power, bar none. But the other is, remember, once you build it, you still have to connect it to the grid. And this is the other controversy, the other friction that now these offshore projects are facing all along the East Coast is the coastal communities are saying, we don't want your power lines coming ashore in our beach town. Put it somewhere else. And so, these are all of a piece. Everything has a footprint. And again, why am I more so pro-nuclear? We can use the existing grid. We don't have to build a lot of new transmission. And what we're seeing all across the Western U.S. is resistance to high voltage transmission. In Iowa, the state legislature in 2017 passed a bill prohibiting the use of eminent domain by private companies to build high voltage transmission. That's law in Iowa now. So all across the U.S., we're finding massive friction to build high voltage transmission. And now with these offshore wind projects, it's the exact same story. And I don't know of any of these transmission projects that have actually been built yet. So, we're building all these wind turbines offshore. Well, okay, that's fine. You have to bring the power ashore somewhere, and that's another friction point.
Well, and the truth is, I think, I read recently that, and this was pre-Inflation Reduction Act. Wind and solar subsidies were roughly 5 times that of oil and gas subsidies. But it is my understanding that clean power subsidies are based on watt-hour production. Is that correct? Are you familiar with that?
Yeah, they're allocated on how much energy they produce, right? So, and that's relates to negative pricing. But if you build a wind project, you get a tax credit based on the number of kilowatt hours, megawatt hours that you feed into the grid. You get a tax credit based on that amount of energy, not power, energy, which is, as you know, energy and power are not the same thing. But if you want that relative comparison, I published this on my Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. The Energy Information Administration's own data shows that in 2022, the solar sector got, on a per unit of energy produced basis, 300 times more in federal tax credits than nuclear. 300x. On a comparison to hydrocarbons, I think it was 80 or 100x. Wind energy got, I think, 150 times more than nuclear. I mean, I'm pro solar. Solar makes a lot of sense in some areas, but if it's so great, if it's so cheap, surely it doesn't need federal tax money. Let it stand on its own. But yet, what's happening? I think it's just a raid on the federal treasury in the name of climate change, and that's why we're seeing so much solar and wind being built around the country.
So if the subsidies are based on wattage, wouldn't nuclear be better? It's so the lower nuclear subsidies, that's a function of just the lack of investment into it, correct?
Well, I mean, there have been under the Inflation Reduction Act, and I need to look this up to verify the numbers, but the Inflation Reduction Act does give some production tax credit incentive to the nuclear sector, but on a relative basis, it's a small fraction of what's going to wind. The solar sector usually uses the investment tax credit. I think it's offshore wind actually uses the investment tax credit as well, but when you look at it again on the metric that matters, which is the amount of energy that is actually produced, it's just very clear. I mean, it's Ray Charles could have seen it, right? That just the amount of federal money that is going to solar in particular and to wind is tens of multiples more than what's going to coal, oil, and natural gas. And you could say, okay, well, that's justifiable, but it's not justifiable when you compare it to nuclear, because nuclear is just fundamentally our best electricity generation technology, and yet it lags far, far, far behind.
Yeah. A lot of people are questioning the subsidies of oil and gas, and I would point out that not an exact number, but I believe the subsidies for oil and gas that are received from the federal government, the federal government gets around between a 700 and 800% return on their investment with those subsidies. So that is something that will never happen with any other type of energy. You're not going to get a 700% return on wind, solar, or nuclear. That's just not going to. The reason that we hear a lot about renewable energy, but we see the growth in fossil fuels, is that fossil fuels is a cash cow for the U.S. government, period. It really is. The U.S. government makes hundreds of billions a year. The state, I don't even want to think about how much money the state of California gets on their gas taxes while they're suing the oil companies. Fossil fuels is a cash cow for the government, and that's why it's still a growing industry. That and the fact that it's absolutely necessary. But
Texas comptroller, this is some years ago, but I interviewed her when she was comptroller, Susan Combs. She said wind and solar are tax takers, oil and gas are tax makers. Right. So I don't know whether your numbers on what billions, what the revenue, it's significant on the federal level, what the federal government collects from federal lands. I know it's a big number here in Texas from university lands, and those go to the University of Texas and Texas A&M from the university lands in West Texas, and the mineral rights and royalties they get paid. But the issue, in addition to what you're talking about in terms of the tax disparity, the tax income versus the tax outflow, is the energy return on energy invested, which is the other part of this that is undeniable when it comes to just the math and the physics. And this relates back to what I said about offshore wind. Offshore wind, one of the problems is it requires so much material inputs, right? Steel, copper, cables, all of these things, zinc, to build these massive offshore platforms. Well, the material intensity is directly related to the energy return on energy invested. So, to your point, the less energy we put into getting energy out, that's the key. We don't want break even. Break even does us no good. We need to put in, 1 unit of energy and get 10 out. That's usually at least what it is in the oil and gas industry. In the early days, it was 1 to 100, something like that. So, this we have to be very sober. I mean, again, I'm not a partisan. I don't work for the oil and gas industry. I don't work for wind. I'm an independent journalist, but I've been studying this for years now. And we have to be very sober about what we're doing. And instead, we're inundated with a lot of hype and a lot of what I'll use the right word here, propaganda around these sources. And, oh, we'll just run the world on wind and solar. No, you can't. You won't. It doesn't work that way. It's easy to say, but we have to live in the real world. And we have to be, yes, we have to be concerned about climate change. I get it. Climate change is a concern. It's not our only concern.
Are you familiar with the recent story about the deal we made with Indonesia and wind energy?
To me, I'm not. I know Indonesia's building a lot of coal-fired power plants so they can smelt nickel and send it to Tesla, but that's a different story.
That's actually related to that story.
Oh.
So, the United States and some other UN nations, Japan, some other countries, they secured $20 billion for Indonesia to increase their wind energy capacity, to build wind turbines, and also to move forward the decommissioning of their coal-fired plants, right? So the United States, Japan, and I'm sure you'll look this up when we're done. They got together. Some of that money is U.S. taxpayer dollars. Some of that money is taxpayer dollars from other countries. Some of it is guarantees on financing from like Deutsche Bank and Wells Fargo or whoever. Anyway, we secured $20 billion for Indonesia so they could clean up and build wind turbines and get rid of coal plants. And the whole time, nobody in our government or the other governments or anybody realized that a lot of the political elite in that country own the coal businesses that operate there. Sure. And they put nothing in the verbiage that stops them from continuing to build more coal plants.
Right.
So they have access to this $20 billion that we secured for them, and now they're just continuing to build coal plants because we didn't tell them they had to stop.
Right.
I don't like that. It is not our responsibility to pay for other countries' energy. And if we are going to take that on, then we should at least do it in a way that makes sense. You're making a deal with people in the coal industry to build wind turbines, and then you're shocked that they're still building coal. And the funny thing is, they're building coal for new industrial parks that they are building to extract minerals for EV batteries.
Yeah, you and what's wrong with this? What's not? I mean, you can't make it up, Matt. You just can't make it up. I mean, I'll do you one better. In Germany, the home of the Energiewende, where they're going to waste, and that is the right word, they are going to waste $1 trillion on the energy transition, the so-called Energiewende. And what did they do in the last few months? They're expanding the Gersweiler coal mine, or it's a lignite mine actually, and to expand it, they had to take down a wind project. So it's like, well, I mean, if a fiction writer wrote that, they'd say, oh, come on, you can't, you're making this up. But let me just make one quick point about Indonesia, because it's an interesting country for a lot of reasons. One is people forget that it's a very large country. The population is more than 200 million. It's rapidly growing. They have enormous power needs. They have incredible energy poverty, and it's an archipelago, right? So it's a whole lot of islands. So you're not going to be able to just make one power plant work. You're going to have a whole bunch of them. Well, so a friend of mine, Robert Hargraves, is a nuclear guy, and they're working. They have a company called Thorcon, and their idea is to use a thorium reactor and onboard a ship. So power ships with nuclear reactors on board that they can pull up along into coastal Indonesia and then just connect them to the grid. So It's a very clever idea. Thorcon needs $1 billion to develop this technology. They haven't been able to raise it, but power ships are an important technology that if you can make them run with nuclear power, this could be and there, it's been done. The Rosatom, the Russian company, they have deployed a nuclear power ship in Pivek in Siberia, and it's producing power today. So I've seen these power ships. I saw them offshore Lebanon a few years ago when I was in Beirut. If we can develop nuclear power ships that are that we can deploy at scale, that's a game changer globally for energy poverty, for CO2 emissions. They're rapidly deployable. They don't require minimal. You can be fabricated fairly quickly in shipyards around the world. It's an incredibly promising idea, but again, it has to scale. It has to be funded, and we haven't seen that yet.
That's fascinating. I was not aware of that. Okay, this could be a bit of a contentious subject for some of my followers. EVs. Probably always contentious everywhere you go because I've heard your opinion on EVs. So what are your thoughts? Pros, cons, just general thoughts on EVs?
Sure. Well, you asked about congressional testimony last month. In fact, January 11th, I submitted written testimony. I didn't go to Washington, just written testimony on electric vehicles and supply chains. And I made 3 points. First was that the history of the EV is very long, and it's a history of failure, tailgating failure. We've heard about the electric vehicle now for over 100 years, and still it's a niche market product. Second point is that it's a niche market product, which I'll come back to. And finally, the supply chains make us dependent on China. So take those in order. The history. I've written 6 books. My latest one's A Question of Power, Electricity and the Wealth of Nations. In 2010, I published a book called Power Hungry, The Myths of Green Energy and the Real Fuels of the Future. And in that book, I detailed the history of the electric vehicle. I found in the Library of Congress, I found news clips. The Los Angeles Times in 1901 said the electric vehicle will succeed as soon as we find a better battery. 1915, the Washington Post said electric prices on electric vehicles are coming down and pretty soon they'll be affordable by everybody. Well, here we are more than 100 years later, and we're still talking about better batteries, and they still are not a mass market product. So I can cite many more examples, but though it's the history of the EV, this is not a new product. We've heard about this for over a century, and still today it's a niche market product. So niche market. I'm sure you saw the news. This was in November. You had over 4,000 auto dealers in the United States sent a letter to President Biden saying these EPA mandates on EVs are too strict. They're piling up on our lots. Customers aren't buying them. You need to throw out this mandate that the EPA has proposed because it's not workable. Well, so I've cited that, but I also cited the fact that Ford Motor Company is now losing between $60,000 and $70,000 for every EV they sell. And you can't make up for that in volume. They're losing staggering amounts of money for every EV they sell. And further, niche market product, about half of all the EVs in America are sold into a handful of heavily Democratic cities and counties. So this is not a mass market product. It's a niche market product, and it's mostly being bought by wealthy, middle-aged white guys. And I am not one of them. Finally, the supply chains. 90% of the neodymium iron boron magnets, which are the high strength, the term of art is high coercivity magnets that are needed for EVs, 90% of them are produced in China. And both the Department of Energy and the Commerce Department have issued very careful reports pointing out this vulnerability on the supply chain. So I could go on about critical minerals, metals, lithium, copper, rare earth elements. China has a stranglehold on the production of all of them. Why, in the name of Peter, Paul, and Mary, is this administration pushing so hard to make our auto sector depend on China? I'm not a China basher. China is going to do what's in the interest of China, but they're not our friend, and we have to understand that. So there are just many problems with EVs. I've been a long time critic. There are people, if people want to buy them, go ahead and buy them. But I fundamentally object to, it's a class issue, it's a fairness issue, it's a supply chain issue. And I continue to be skeptical, and I will be skeptical for a very long time.
But they're fast, Robert. They're really fast.
I've driven the Tesla. I mean, it's impressive. It's an impressive car, and and it's pretty well put together. And yeah, they're fast, but it's a luxury car, and you know, this is not a car for the masses, and it never has been. And the idea that California is going to prohibit the sale of internal combustion engines. Well, what about the working class? What about the bricklayers, the carpenters? What about the baristas? They can't afford these vehicles, and if they live in an apartment, they can't charge it. So a lot of this, policy, and I told you my politics. I'm not a member of any organized party. But the thing that concerns me more broadly right now about the United States broadly is the class issue. And now with a lot of these energy policies, there's simply regressive taxes on the poor and the middle class. Bans on natural gas, bans on the use of electrify everything, the bans on internal combustion engines. And remember, a lot of these policies are being promulgated not by legislators, not by elected officials, but by the administrative state. In California, the ban on internal combustion engines didn't come from the California Assembly, it came from the California Air Resources Board.
Yeah. And I've always been one, as I consider myself a free market person, and in my mind, the market will decide. Yeah. And I think the market should decide everything. And there are a lot of people in this country that have EVs and that will want EVs, but to completely ban anything other than that is, I agree, a step too far for sure. And it is. A lot of this comes from, the people on the left who spend their days as defenders of, the people that the have-nots, they spend their days defending the poor and the needy and all of that. And a lot of these policies have very negative effects towards those very people. And I agree with you 100% on that. And I think EVs are cool. For me, they're not practical for me. Like, I live in the middle of the country, and I don't feel like there's going to be a ton of EVs in the middle of the country where people drive a lot more. And so I think they'll find their place kind of where they belong. But when you start banning all this stuff and making demands like that, I just think it's a step too far, especially from our government.
Well, I was in North Dakota. I was in Bismarck last week, in fact, on a speaking engagement. And I presented at a conference there, and I did some calculations before I got there. So it is a class issue, right? Who can afford these vehicles? And the average profile for an electric vehicle buyer is a household income of $120,000 or more. And as I said, they're generally white, middle-aged males, right? So that's the profile. Roughly the same profile for a Generac buyer too, by the way. But North Dakota, I was up there and it was cold. North Dakota has the fewest EVs per capita of any state in America. And why is that? Well, partly it's a big state, right? People there drive long distances. It's cold. I think there's 700,000 people in North Dakota, right? But Mississippi and North Dakota are the two lowest, have the fewest EVs per capita of any state in the U.S. California, meanwhile, has the most. And they're on average 27 times more EVs per capita in California than in North Dakota and Mississippi. So there are these geographic disparities. So why should taxpayers in North Dakota be subsidizing the development or pay for EV charging stations in California for rich people in California who live in coastal counties who are, where's the equity here? Why would people in Mississippi be subsidizing this? So, there are a lot of factors here that go beyond just the car itself and about who we see ourselves as people. How is this an equitable situation? And my response to people, my EV does this, my EV does that. It's great. Okay, that's fine for you. But don't tell me I have to buy one. because I'm not going to do it. I'm familiar with them, but I have a bunch of 10-year-old cars. I don't want a new car. I don't need a new car. I'm not going to buy one just because I can go 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. The number of times in my life I need to go 0 to 60 in 3 seconds is probably about zero. My car's fast enough. There's a lot of traffic here in Austin, Texas. I don't need to go faster than that.
Anytime the people of Minot are subsidizing the people of Malibu, we've got a problem. Because I've been to Minot and I've been to Malibu, and the people of Minot should not be subsidizing the people of Malibu.
Yeah, if I can interrupt, there was just one comment. Someone said, they're not forcing you to buy an EV, my dude. Okay, well, my dude, the EPA has a proposed rule that would require U.S. automakers by 2032 to be selling 2/3 of the vehicles they sell to be all electric. So there is a rule afoot, again, not by the U.S. Congress, not promulgated by elected officials, but promulgated by bureaucrats, by people who are in the administrative state who want to mandate the type of vehicles that are sold. And again, I think this is wrong from a policy standpoint. And what's interesting now is what is the Supreme Court going to do on the Chevron question, right? This is a critically important ruling. And but the administrative state, I think, is just fundamentally out of control. And we need to bring them back under control, because this kind of move that would fundamentally force the auto sector to remake itself, it's disastrous. And that's why you see 4,000 dealerships in the United States saying this is bad policy. Now, will the Biden administration backtrack? We don't know. But the problem, Matt, in both the auto sector and the utility sector is the amount of uncertainty this is creating, uncertainty in the marketplace, and investors hate uncertainty.
Yeah. Yeah. And I'm glad you brought that up, because I was just going to ask you about the Chevron doctrine. And mainly because I don't know that much about it. I've read about it a little bit. But so for the people in the comment sections, one of the reasons that I have become so fascinated with energy and electricity outside of my oil and gas career is I'm looking at all the things we're doing, and I'm listening to Robert Bryce tell me about the future growth of electricity demand. And my sense is we're stunting electricity in a critical time where electricity demand is going to explode. So, Robert, would you care to talk about the future growth of electricity demand and how the things we're doing now could affect the energy security of people in the future?
Sure. Let me break that into two parts. First, let's look globally, because, the U.S., we're incredibly lucky in the United States. We live in energy abundance that, many people in the rest of the world can only dream about. I mean, just truly, right? I'm buying gasoline for $2.50 a gallon, right? This is cheap. But in the globally, electricity demand is doubling every 2 decades, every 2.5 decades, something like that. And nearly all of that growth is happening in developing countries like China, India, Indonesia, Vietnam, Thailand, Pakistan, you name it, right? Highly populated countries, many of them Islamic. Africa population is growing, and their power demand is growing as well. So while in the U.S. our power demand is growing slowly, I think it actually declined, if I'm not mistaken, in 2023 slightly, but our power demand has leveled off, right? It hasn't grown much at all in the last 20 years. But we're expecting a lot of new demand growth from data centers, potentially for electric vehicles, potentially from this electrify everything push, which I think, again, is disastrous. But nevertheless, we're putting more and more strain on the grid, and the grid is already straining to keep up with existing demand, much less some massive new amount of demand from new sources like data centers, et cetera. So globally, demand is growing enormously, particularly in Southern Asia. Here in the U.S., we face different challenges where we're adding a lot of intermittent generation, solar and wind, and we're having to accommodate that with new high voltage transmission, more transformers, et cetera, more linemen, more infrastructure in general. But it's not necessarily the case that we're adding a lot of new electricity sales. So in other words, we're building a lot more stuff, but not selling more units of energy. So prices are going up. So we're facing a lot of different challenges. But one of the reasons why I made this new docuseries, Juice, Power, Politics, and the Grid, is we're putting a lot of new demands on the grid. We're taking it for granted. We're assuming we can add a lot of this in weather-dependent generation without any negative effects, and that's a big assumption and a dangerous one because we're already seeing the grid faltering under existing demand. So we made this docuseries, my colleague Tyson Culver and I did, because we wanted to call attention to what is happening in America, and it's very dangerous. And I saw it myself here in Austin, when we got blacked out 3 years ago. So juicetheseries.com, I'm going to keep plugging it if you don't mind, juicetheseries.com. It's free. We made this project with all 5 episodes. They're free. You can find it on YouTube, but the easiest place to find it is juicetheseries.com.
So what about Africa? Do we see any developing or emerging countries in Africa that isn't Africa the place where there's a lot of energy insecurity?
There is. And to put it into rough perspective, these are rough numbers, but there are about 1.2 billion people living in Africa. That number might be a little higher now. 1.2 billion. Those 1.2 billion people use approximately the same amount of electricity as 35 million Canadians. It's maybe a little more, right? But to give you some perspective on how much electricity is consumed in the entire continent of Africa versus a fairly wealthy country like Canada. So the energy needs there in Africa and it's a very young population. In the future, demand growth should be enormous. Now, will they be able to escape? Energy use and poverty go hand in hand, right? You have to have money to buy more energy. When you use more energy, you get richer, but it's a virtuous cycle. You need both, right? You need the rule of law. You need a strong, stable society in order to have a functioning electric grid. So making Africa prosper will have to happen because Africans want to prosper, and they can stamp out corruption. They can make them, have durable and self-governments and responsive governments. That's a big challenge because a lot of African countries struggle with that. And it's not a slur on Africa, it's just the reality. But if you look at ExxonMobil's projections for future energy demand, they expect a lot of growth out of Africa. And I do too. And I think there's some countries there that could do well, but it's going to take time.
Yeah. And that's what I wasn't sure of because, when I look at Africa, you have this huge continent. And it's to me, there's so much just empty space there. And to me, it looks like the last continent that's going to go through a huge industrialization period. When that happens, who knows? But we do know that, if countries like, China and the United States and the big players around the world start pumping money into Africa, which has already happened, then that entire continent or big portions of it will start to develop and their energy demands will explode. Don't know when that'll be, but it's just something you have to know is going to happen in the future as time goes by.
Well, and there's some very interesting things happening in Africa as well with regard to hydrocarbons, right? They've been the massive offshore gas discoveries, offshore Tanzania and other countries, I think Mauritania, just enormous discoveries there. So Africa has enormous natural resources, natural resource base. The challenge is going to be for them to keep as much of those natural resources at home so that they can be exploited in Africa instead of all being exported. So the countries that, Ghana is a country that is often held up as one that has a lot of potential because they have the rule of law. They've got, a pretty good self-governance. Their grid is stabilized. They're able to grow. Nigeria continues to have problems with corruption. It's not a new story. It's not a colonialist to say that. It's just the reality. The Nigerian grid, they've spent billions trying to upgrade it, and still it's the country's grid continues to falter. So there's a lot of opportunity in Africa. Ghana is one country that is talking about using nuclear. We talked about that before, possibly building small modular reactors in Ghana. So there's a lot of potential there. South Africa, that's a country that already has a nuclear power. They want to expand there, but before they do that, they're going to probably expand their coal fleet. I had Hugo Kruger on my podcast to talk about that. He's a South African engineer living in Paris that knows a great deal about that. He's on Substack, but I'm fascinated by Africa, and as you say, it's a place where there's a lot of latent energy demand that if it develops in a reasonable manner, you're just going to see enormous demand for all kinds of energy there.
Yeah.
So to switch gears a little bit, a few months ago, I criticized Joe Biden for his actions in Venezuela.
Yeah.
Because I feel like we have this country, we have sanctions placed on them. He gives them a 6-month probationary period, which I believe was kind of a gift to Chevron. But that, and I stated back then a few months ago that that's not how I would have handled that situation. Well, now it's obvious that Maduro is not going to play, he's not going to do what we want him to do, which is what I predicted a few months ago.
Yeah.
And so the president is now going to be in this situation where he is going to have to decide if the sanctions or if the relief of sanctions if he just lets those expire. Right. And it's not a great deal of oil, but there is an election coming, and now the president has put himself in a position with a dictator where he's going to have to make a decision. Do we allow them to keep pumping oil or exporting oil, or do we reimpose the sanctions? Yeah. I'm assuming you're very familiar with that whole thing. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah. Let me just put a placeholder on Venezuela for 1 second, because one more quick thought on Africa. One of the reasons why I'm so pro electricity, and I wrote about this in a paper that I wrote about it in my last book, but also for a paper I wrote for the Alliance for Responsible Citizenship for their conference in London last October. Why is electricity so important in the developing world? Because it liberates women and girls from the pump, the stove, and the wash tub. And I cited a study that the United Nations did a few years ago on especially countries in Africa where electricity use is very low. Women are effectively slaves. I mean, they are effectively slaves. And child marriage, that is where women are married off before the age of 18, it's rampant. So some of the countries with the lowest electricity consumption have the highest rates of child marriage. So when I talk about electricity, yes, it's about human development, but it's incredibly important for women and girls. And that was one of the motivations for Lyndon Johnson, George Norris, Burton Wheeler for the electrification of rural America in the United States, was to help farm women escape the drudgery of that menial labor. But now back to Venezuela. Nicolas Maduro is a narco. He's a known narco. He is a drug trafficker. And yet this administration, and I'm not a partisan, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not a Republican, I'm pointing out what is well known. Maduro and his pals are known drug traffickers. Why are we throwing them any bones for any reason? They not only, and Hugo Chavez decimated PDVSA, the Venezuelan national oil company. He devastated it and gutted the entire company, put a bunch of cronies in there. Venezuelan oil production has been plummeting ever since. The PDVSA was the pride of South American oil companies. Now it's one of the worst producing, one of the worst performers. And the Biden administration, because they're desperate to, by what it looks like to me, punish domestic oil and gas companies, is going out of its way to help the narco Venezuelan. I'm sorry, it's crazy town, Matt. It's just I don't want to get too technical here. It's full on bonkers, crazy town foolishness. And yet this is what passes for energy policy in America these days. I don't understand it. How do we get leverage in the geopolitics in the world today? We produce more energy, we help our friends in Europe, and instead we cancel LNG export, which hurts our friends in Europe. Instead of growing the industrial base in the United States, we're trying to export it. I just can't. I'm all in on America. I'm bullish on the United States. We can afford a lot of foolishness, but not too much.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's why I was critical of it to begin with. I wasn't even taking into consideration the fact, of him being a narco. I mean, to me, and it was another example of allowing what's going on in the moment to dictate your energy policy. I felt like it's only 200 or 300,000 barrels of oil a day. Is it that, like, is it really going to affect gas prices and help you that much? Because I felt like that was really driving his decision. Like, he was getting attacked from all sides on gas prices. And I personally felt like that had something to do with it. But I don't believe in rewarding people like that before they have given us a reason to reward them. Before they have given us a reason to reward them.
Yeah. Here's a Department of Justice report from. Am I getting some feedback here? Here's a Department of Justice. A Department of Justice press release. This is March 26, 2020. Headline is Nicolas Maduro and 14 current and former Venezuelan officials charged with narco terrorism, corruption, drug trafficking, and other criminal charges. This is the Department of Justice, not me. Maduro and other high-ranking officials allegedly partnered with the FARC, which is the Colombian terrorist organization, to use cocaine as a weapon to, quote, flood the United States. This is the Department of Justice, not me. And yet now we're rewarding Maduro less than 4 years later. Where's the sensibility on this policy?
I don't know. I don't know. But to go back to the electricity, I really appreciate your comments about the impact on women, because I don't think people think enough into it to realize what it's like to live in a world where you just don't have electricity. We have all been given the gift of being born and growing up in America, or maybe some of us came here, however that worked. But the fact of the matter is we're all here. And I don't think people in this country can truly understand not just what it's like to live without access to electricity, but all of the like social and cultural atrocities that can come from that being a thing. And you did a great job with your comment there, highlighting that about how it affects particularly women.
Yeah.
And that's one of the reasons I'm such a big fan of yours, because you think about those things. And that's a huge thing. That is a huge thing.
Just to interrupt there. So in my last book, I quote both Lyndon Johnson and George Norris. George Norris was a Nebraskan. He was a senator in the early 1900s, and he was an ally of FDR for rural electrification in the 1930s. But in his memoir, it's called Fighting Liberal, which I think was published in 1945. And George Norris is still held in very high regard in Nebraska. And I was in Kearney. I spoke in Kearney, Nebraska 2 months ago. He was one of the people who was responsible for Nebraska being the only state in America with a unicameral legislature. So anyway, but Norris was a big advocate for the TVA, a huge advocate for rural electrification. And in his memoir, Fighting Liberal, he has this really beautiful passage where he writes about farm women and electrification, and that he said, I had known the cold, what it was like to be out on a cold winter night milking the cow by the light of a lantern. He said, why wouldn't I want women to be freed from that drudgery? And I'm paraphrasing. The way he wrote it was poetic, in fact, and very powerful. But we're so removed now, we in America, from those days of living on the farm and understanding what manual labor is, understanding what it means to tend livestock through all hours of the day, 365 days a year when it's cold, raining, nasty, and to be out there in a shed with no lights, no power, and you're holding a lantern. That's, we don't even think about that anymore, but it's not that long ago. It's my grandmother's era was pre-electricity, right? This isn't some ancient history. My friend Chris Cawthon, his dad, Ron Cawthon, I wrote about this last July 4th. He grew up in Veneta, Oklahoma. He remembers the day they got electric power in his farm. I mean, this isn't ancient history. This is the generation before mine. I'm an old guy, right? I'm 63. But Ron's in his 80s. He remembers the day. He remembers it vividly.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man. So oil and gas. Oil and gas and the potential ramifications of the Supreme Court with the Chevron doctrine. Does that, if the court decides that so for my people in the comments section, really quickly, and I've done a video on the Chevron doctrine, but I'm going to be completely honest. Robert can probably speak better on it than I can. So can you tell them real quick what the Chevron doctrine is? The court decision. Do you remember?
Well, I could take a stab at it, but generally it is that the court ruled that in general the government should cede or adhere to what the administrative state says. It was effectively saying, oh well, if you're in the bureaucracy and Congress has some general guidance, well then the administrative state decides what that is. But now we've seen the administrative state really just take over. So I can't cite chapter and verse on it at all. I can't begin to. But in broad terms, what's at issue now with the Supreme Court is the extent to which the court is going to allow the administrative state to decide major questions, right? And that's it. I think it's major question doctrine about, Clean Air Act, like, the West Virginia versus EPA case, right? That was part of this, trying to decide how much power entities like the EPA are going to be given and whether, in fact, they can do things such as tell the automakers without any, so much as by your leave from Congress, by in 7 years, 8 years, 2/3 of the vehicles you can sell have to be all electric. Well, it's a massive, massive imposition on those automakers in terms of and costs. So, tens of billions, hundreds of billions of dollars. So it's an incredibly important court case.
Yeah, that was my understanding that the original case, which was Chevron was a part of, and that's why it's called the Chevron doctrine, is that they had determined that since Congress essentially puts those people in those positions of authority at places like the EPA, then they can basically write that policy. Yeah. And that was my understanding of it, but I didn't have a lot of the nuance. And so when you have, I don't want to call it an organization, but a group like the EPA saying, hey, no more methane, or no more internal combustion engines. That should be something that is passed with legislation through Congress, is the argument. And no single government organization should have the power to dictate those kind of weighted decisions on the country. Yeah. And so currently, the Supreme Court
had a good explanation. One of the comments was that federal courts should defer to federal agencies, right? And so I think that's a pretty good way to describe it, as I understand it. But I'm not a lawyer. I don't play one on television. But ultimately, this is about the power that Congress and the federal government is going to cede to the bureaucracy.
Yeah. So if the court determines and basically does away with the Chevron doctrine, then a lot of that stuff will have to go back to either courts or to Congress?
I think so. But remember, Matt, the issue here still is uncertainty. And, I travel the country a lot. I'm incredibly lucky in my career. I mean, I'm so blessed and fortunate to do what I do, because I get to go out into rural America, Kearney, Nebraska, Des Moines, different small towns, talk to ranchers, talk to farmers, talk to small cooperatives, small electric cooperatives about what's going on. The problems that they're facing now is all this uncertainty with the regulatory state. So even if, the EPA has with their greenhouse gas rule, which is something I don't think we've talked about. We talked about the tailpipe rule, but they also have a pending greenhouse gas rule that could affect 90% of the coal and gas-fired generators in America. This is an enormously important proposed rule. Well, so if you're in a cooperative in, say, rural Nebraska or in Missouri, or I was in North Dakota, they're heavily coal dependent in those in North Dakota in particular. Well, given all these rules that are proposed that could be litigated for years, what do you do? Where do you place your bets when you have to bet, effectively bet is the right word, tens of millions of dollars on pollution control devices, ash disposal, carbon capture and sequestration, all of these things that are pending that now will have to go through court review. Well, then you got lawyers, and it's going to take years before you get some kind of decision of any clarity in the future. And this is one of the key problems that I think more broadly is we're facing in America. It's this Supreme Court ruling is important, but still there's going to be this litigation that drags it out. So, these are very complex problems, and the issue is how quickly they can be resolved and have some clarity.
Yeah. And so someone in the comments section said we're leaving climate out of the discussion. This whole discussion goes back to the climate, because what we're saying, and I think the point Robert is trying to make, is that in order for us to achieve something, say with the climate, it's going to take years and years of investment by private companies and individuals in order to achieve that. And when the energy policy is so scattered and kind of comes and goes at a whim, when there's no certainty in what's going to happen because of things like, the EPA just coming out with these rules, and we know that it could go to court, it could be overturned, this can happen, like 1,000 things can happen, then that completely stymies investment, whether you're pro-renewable or pro-oil and gas or whatever you support. The things we're talking about are very important, because without years of investment that comes from corporations and individuals, we can't achieve any of the things we want to achieve. And that's why we need to have a clear-cut energy policy and not just flying by the seat of our pants, right? So this is about the climate. This is absolutely about the climate, because, Robert's talking about, methane emissions and this and that. If all of that can be overturned in court in 2 years, nobody is going to invest in any of the things required to meet those methane goals. Does that make sense? Like it's going to stall and nothing is going to happen. Yeah. So just because we're not using the word climate doesn't mean this doesn't all impact the climate, because this impacts everything. Energy policy impacts all of it. Sure. And if the people with money, and I mean, like it or not, it is the people with the money that invest in these things. It's not the average everyday person. If they don't have certainty in what they're investing in, then it's not going to be invested in. And we're going to fail at whatever we try to do regarding energy. Yeah. Full stop. If there's no clarity, we're going to fail.
Yeah. And that's the problem. And I hear it from the, people who are running electric co-ops. They're like, what do we do? Where do we place our bets given all of this uncertainty? And I think one other point is important to make here, which is that these battles are going to continue, and this uncertainty is going to continue regardless of whether it's Trump or Biden or, who knows whether they're the two final nominees. We're still a long way from November, but that's the way it looks like right now. Okay. So whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, don't forget that you have hundreds of millions of dollars that will be spent by the anti-industry industry. That is, the NGOs that are climate focused to litigate, to try and push policy that closes our reliable power plants. And this is what's happening. In fact, in North Dakota, I was just there. I said the Sierra Club has sued Basin Electric over upgrades to their coal plant. So that creates uncertainty. And now here's Basin Electric, a co-op, is having to fight in court against the Sierra Club. Well, who's funding the Sierra Club? Michael Bloomberg, one of the richest people in the world, who gave them $500 million, the Beyond Carbon campaign, of which Sierra Club is part of it, in September, gave them $500 million. So it's not just the administrative state that's in this battle. It's also this anti-industry, what I call the industrial corporate climate complex, the NGO industrial corporate climate complex. There is an enormous amount of money behind these anti-hydrocarbon groups. So I've seen some of the comments too. It's like, oh, well, he's a Republican. He's speaking for the hydrocarbon industry. Who do I want to represent? Who do I want to speak for? I want to speak for the poor and the middle class. I want to speak for the working class people, because my view on climate is very clear. Climate change is a concern. It is not our only concern. And we have to be very sober about how we go forward. Otherwise, we end up like Germany. Otherwise, we end up like Britain, with deindustrialization, high unemployment, and enormously high energy and power prices. That's the enemy of the poor. And I will stand on that soapbox all day long. Expensive energy is the enemy of the poor. And yet there seems to be no recognition of that and the regressive nature of this from the industry, or I would argue many of the policymakers and the people in the administrative state. They simply don't care.
Yeah. Yeah, and I would say, and this is the reason when I get in these lives, I don't pay a ton of attention to the comments, because you get a lot of negative comments. But if for the people in the comment section that are saying that the climate is, your primary concern, if the climate is your primary concern, then you should be outraged at the way we're addressing the climate right now, because everything we are doing is nothing that works to help the climate. No matter what me and Robert talk about and our opinions about electricity and nuclear and wind and solar, what we know for sure is that, and this is what's really frustrating to me, if the climate emergency is the emergency that we are being told that it is, our response to it is the worst response to any emergency in history. It really is, because we have absolutely no chance whatsoever of getting to net zero by 2050. It's not even a thing that can possibly happen. And so this is what we're talking about, and this is why these discussions are important. For the people that they're super concerned about climate change, if that is your fear and that is your concern, then your current government is failing you miserably if you want them to act on climate. Because what we're doing right now is not really acting on climate on a global scale. We're playing politics and we're playing ideology with different sources of power. We're doing nothing to help the planet. Not really. We're not doing anything to help the planet.
Well, and I'll just follow up on that with a couple of quick points. One is, the U.S. has reduced its CO2 emissions on an absolute basis more than any other country in the world over the past 20 years. And it's not even close. And that's largely a story of nat gas displacing coal in the power sector. So that is something that the U.S. can take some pride in. But we also are making, I think, our grid too reliant on a single fuel, that is natural gas. So I want to keep the existing coal plants open until we can replace them with nuclear plants. Second, the U.S. can play a key role here globally with the global emissions story, because we talked about earlier, the emissions that are coming and the growing emissions from India, China, Indonesia, other developing countries are swamping any CO2 emissions reductions that we're achieving here in the U.S. So what should we be thinking about? Building and deploying nuclear power plants at scale that we can deploy around the world. That's the obvious way forward. This administration has done some positive things on nuclear. They could do a lot more. So again, we have to be very sober about these issues. And it's not about political ideology. It's not about left versus right. It's about math and physics. And that's the story. Math and physics are going to rule the day, not what I believe about climate change, what you believe about climate change. It's about the math of energy poverty. It's about the physics of fission versus the insanely bad power density of wind and corn ethanol. We need to be embracing power density, and that's why I'm so pro-nuclear. So, I could go all day on these issues, but again, it's one of the reasons why I made this new docuseries. Back to that, juicetheseries.com, came out on Wednesday. I was motivated to do this because so much of our policy is going the wrong direction. We're pushing the wrong things. We cannot rely on wind and solar to fuel our economy. It can't be done. It's a fool's errand. Despite all the hype, despite all the propaganda, we have to be very sober about this. And so That's why I'm so motivated to do what I do, and I'm having so much fun at it because I'm all in on this. This is my purpose and my passion. I got nothing else. I'm not going to play golf. Golf sucks.
And what it is, it is the politicians and the media's job to get people emotional about climate. It is their job. And so how the average, person feels about the climate comes from a place of emotion and fear. But it takes different kind of people to figure out how to move forward and fix that using science and data and things that work. And so anytime you say, wind turbines are not the answer, suddenly you're pro oil. It can't possibly be that wind turbines aren't the answer, right? Because we've been convinced that they are. But I study this tirelessly, and the people that follow me know how brutally honest I am. And I am telling you, wind turbines are not going to fix anything you are concerned about. And your concerns are coming from an emotional place, and we're thinking about this from a data-driven research, place. Like, we're looking at the numbers on the paper, okay? And it's not about being pro-oil. It's not about being pro-fossil fuels. I am in the oil business. My business isn't going anywhere. I'm not concerned about wind turbines doing something to my business, because I know the United States is still going to be producing as much oil as they are today when I am dead and gone. It's none of my concern. My concern is the future and all of the things Robert talked about with energy security, and the point, I think the strongest thing he drove home was, the thing about women and energy security and what it's like to live where there's no access to electricity, and how that socially and culturally changes the entire world that they live in and the atrocities they go through because just simple thing like electricity doesn't exist. That's what this is about. It's about finding answers and solutions that actually work, and dispelling with the emotions and just thinking, oh, well, this, it's what actually works. Because my frustration is that I don't think we're doing things that actually work, and we're spending hundreds of billions, if not trillions of dollars on things that aren't going to fix the emergency that we're being told we're in. They're simply not going to fix it. And any rational, reasonable person just looking at the data would look at that and say, that's not going to work, because it's not. And that has nothing to do with being pro anything, right?
It's what I've said. It's not about ideology. It's not about what I believe. As I said, I'm not part of a political party. I wouldn't be part of any political party that would have me. But we have to be very sober about this. Let me give you a couple of numbers since you talked about wind and solar. I've written about this on my Substack. I do a lot of public speaking. I present this slide on this pretty much every time I talk. Between 2004 and 2022, according to Bloomberg New Energy Finance, not my numbers, the numbers, global spending on solar and wind was $4.1 trillion. $4.1 trillion globally. Over that same time period, the growth in hydrocarbons, and over that time period, wind and solar grew about 32 exajoules. Over that same time period, oil and gas consumption grew more than 100 exajoules. In other words, hydrocarbon growth was 3 times faster than the growth in wind and solar combined. Not my numbers, the numbers. So we have to be very sober about these ideas about, oh, we're just going to replace, hydrocarbons with wind and solar. Show me the proof that there is an energy transition happening anywhere in the world. Hydrocarbon consumption continues to grow faster than the growth in wind and solar, and it's not even close. So are we switching some coal to some gas? Yes, that's true. We're switching from one hydrocarbon to another hydrocarbon. That's maybe a win. I got that. But nevertheless, the growth in coal demand in China alone is swamping the reductions in coal demand here in the United States. One other quick point, which is in the comments, I just noticed some people talking about nuclear and safety and the rest of it. My line on nuclear safety, and I was at Fukushima Daiichi a year ago. I went to the plant, and like I said, I've been incredibly lucky in my career. I got to go to Japan. I got to see Fukushima Daiichi. I saw the ruined reactors. Not a single person in Japan died of radiation. Not one. The people who died from Fukushima Daiichi were the people who got removed, and the stress of the move was deadly. The health reports have shown this very clearly. The moving the people away from the slightly radioactive areas around Fukushima Daiichi was worse for the population in terms of public health than leaving them there. There were 2 people that died at the plant. They drowned. So we have, as a society, an irrational fear of radiation, and overcoming that will be hard. But the reality is that, whether it was Chernobyl, whether it was Fukushima Daiichi, 3 Mile Island, these accidents, and they've been serious. But the idea that we're facing this dangerous radiation. No, we're surrounded by radiation. I'm getting radiation from the sun right now. But we have this irrational fear, and the anti-industry, these NGOs, these anti-nuclear NGOs, are flaming the fans of that fire, fanning the flames of that fire. They are scaring the public on purpose for no reason. And so we have to, the challenges facing nuclear are real and they're serious, but we have to move past them.
Yeah, and we also, one thing that frustrates me is we have to have some confidence in the fact that it's now 2024. We have technology that we've never had before. This is what bothers me about, not building any new refineries in the United States. An environmental group shuts down the progress of a new refinery being built because they don't understand that new refinery is 95% cleaner than the one that we're running that was built in 1902. And it's the same way with nuclear. I don't know when 3 Mile Island was built, but I have a feeling they didn't have the technology that we have today.
Right.
Just a hunch, okay? And we have no confidence in the things that we can do now, and we carry these fears from the things that happened long ago.
Yeah.
And I don't know when that reactor in Japan was built either. But I just feel like in this day and age, with all the things we can do and the technology we have and the things we're able to build, the things we're able to accomplish, that we can do this safely. I'm not afraid of, because of 3 Mile Island, that gives me no fear about a new nuclear reactor being built because I know how much better we are.
Yeah. Well, and a lot of these new reactors, and I'm hopeful, but I'm also very sober about the prospects for new nuclear. Let's be clear. I mean, all you have to do is, if you're listening or watching on your computer, Google the ticker symbol SMR, New York Stock Exchange company, NuScale. They trade under the ticker SMR. That company is called NuScale Power. They're likely to go bankrupt. They have a workable design for a small modular reactor, but they're having trouble getting purchase in the market. And so, the road to new nuclear is not going to be quick, cheap, or easy. I'm very sober about this. I'm not standing here jumping on the bandwagon and saying this is all going to happen quickly. No, none of this is going to happen quickly. And that's the other part of this climate discussion about, we'll just switch, we'll just build a whole lot of new wind and solar. We'll just double, triple the size of the high voltage transmission sector or high voltage transmission network. No, you won't. You can't. It won't happen because it can't happen. We don't have enough land. We don't have enough linemen. We don't have enough transformers. These systems evolve slowly over time, and we have to be very cognizant of that reality. And so, this is the other part of this political side of this that people don't want to hear. We're going to ban LNG exports, and that's going to have an immediate effect on the climate. No, it won't. But it sells well for a certain small group of the subset of the voting public, and so they can hold that up and say, see, we won. But that short-termism is the enemy of what we should be aiming at, which is long-termism with new nuclear, with more uranium mining processing here in the U.S., more domestic manufacturing. It requires a long-term outlook, and we don't have that.
Yeah, we don't have a long-term vision. I mean, we have one long-term vision, but it makes no sense. But well, Robert, I've kept you on here for an hour and a half, which is probably longer than you expected.
It's great fun. I love this. This is what I do. I don't have another job. I'm dedicated to these issues. This is not all I do and not all I think about. I'm a family guy. I'm going to go spend some time with my wife. It's Friday, right? But it's my purpose and my passion, and it's why I wrote 6 books. It's why I made this docuseries. It's why I have the Power Hungry podcast. It's why I'm, doing 20 or more speaking engagements this year. I'm busy. But it's because I'm passionate for these issues, because we have to be very sober about what we're doing. So let me give you one quick other pitch now, since we're closing. So juicetheseries.com. That's where you can watch the new docuseries, Juice, Power, Politics, and the Grid, 5-part docuseries. Each episode's about 20 minutes. Be sure to watch episode 3. I'm really proud of that one. Matt and I are both from Oklahoma. I'm a native of Oklahoma. My great uncle was a member of the Osage tribe. What the wind industry did on Osage traditional lands in Osage County, Oklahoma, is just a scandal. And they just got spanked in federal court. And so, particularly proud of episode 3, juicetheseries.com. I'm on Substack, robertbryce.substack.com. The Power Hungry podcast is available where all fine podcasts are sold. And I'm here on TikTok, of course, at Power Hungry, PWR Hungry, LinkedIn, YouTube, whatever. I'm on the Google. You can find me.
And isn't the compensatory ruling still pending on the Osage?
Yes, it is.
And would you think that could be in the billions with a B? Could it?
So I told you, I'm long and deep roots in Oklahoma. I'm a member of the Cherokee tribe. My uncle was a member of the Osage tribe. My cousin has an Osage head right. I interviewed Everett Waller, who's the chairman of the Osage Minerals Council, on my podcast a few weeks ago. The Osage Minerals Council was the plaintiff in the case against Enel, the Italian company that built this wind project and mined Osage minerals without the tribe's consent and violated their sovereignty. So taking the 84 turbines down, which is what the federal judge ruled, will cost Enel at least $300 million. I think it might be more than that. The tribe is also going to seek compensatory damages for the damage they did and for the violation of their sovereignty. And when I asked Waller, I said, so how much are you going to ask for? And he said, well, it rhymes with millions. So when you do the math on how much money Enel has taken, how much profit they've taken from that wind project, the tribe is going to seek multiples of that. So it's easy to see how they could justify compensatory damages of billions of dollars.
Yeah, not only that, but they also ignored prior court rulings and continued on.
A Bureau of Indian Affairs letter in 2011 and another one that was sent directly to them in 2014 saying you need to get a permit from the tribe to mine these minerals or these rocks. And not only did Enel ignore the BIA, the Bureau of Indian Affairs, they sped up the work. Yeah. So the arrogance that this company showed, again, if the oil and gas industry had done anything like this, the New York Times would be reporting on it left and right. That ruling from the federal court in Tulsa was December 20th. The New York Times has still not written a single word about this Osage tribal victory against over Enel. It's, I used to think the liberal media was a fiction, not anymore.
And I don't read the newspaper.
I'm a reporter. This is all I've done my whole career. I used to think it was a fiction. Not so much.
Is the New York Times a left-leaning publication? I honestly have no idea. I don't read the papers. Well, Robert, thank you so much for joining me and giving me an hour and a half of your valuable time. And for my followers, I had a lot of people who were excited to see this today. And I've talked a lot about your documentary on TikTok and tried to push people towards it because it was just so educational. Like I learned so much on your first documentary, and I know dozens of people that went and watched it, and just a great piece of work. I'll keep looking for you on TikTok. Thank you again so much for coming and having this discussion. I think we got a lot of people riled up in the comment section, which I love.
They're easy to rile, aren't they? That's okay though. But look, I'm flattered to be invited, Mr. Global. Just great fun, and let's do it again sometime.
Absolutely. Thanks,
okay.
Robert.
All right, y'all. Thank you. Bye.
Thanks, everyone.